There were two avenues that led to the design of this presentation. One came from difficulties we each have encountered over the years in an environment generally hostile to our science. The other came from the enjoyment of watching a puppy and our grandson during their first encounters with a mirror. As for those initial reactions to a mirror, it was truly heartwarming to watch these young beings grapple with their otherworldly experiences. The puppy was particularly hilarious, as it tried in vain to enter that other world to engage with its potential new playmate. Aside from the enjoyment of watching our grandson and the puppy, it dawned on us that the mirror could have tremendous potential as an education tool. We begin with an empty mirror. We will use this mirror as our blank conceptual canvas for addressing a number of basic issues that emerge from the act of analyzing an observation. Throughout the presentation, we will be addressing the perspective of the character on the right. In doing so, we will also consider this person to be your avatar, because it is your reactions to the images in the mirror that fundamentally determine the outcome of this lesson. Here we see a stylized version of a young person looking at herself in the mirror. Imagine for a moment that she is a student who has been studying psychology. Generally, on such a course, the first introduction to behavior analysis is through a few lectures on Pavlov, who worked with dogs, and B.F. Skinner's work with rats and pigeons. Somewhere along the way, there will be a statement about Skinner's radical behaviorism, one that runs something like this. Skinner was so radical in his ideas that he regarded people as black boxes, with nothing of interest taking place inside them. In other words, since one cannot see what is happening inside another person, he thought that whatever is happening is of little value to an objective science. Psychology, it is said, takes a different approach. In fact, students will also be told that behavior analysis is of historical interest only, or something to that effect. This position is reflected in the extent to which research conducted by behavior analysts is integrated into the rest of their psychology course. This image represents the perspective of viewing someone as a black box.
But hold on a minute.
The avatar says,
That's me in the mirror. Are you saying, I am so stupid as to consider anything happening inside me as irrelevant?
She continues.
Irrelevant to whom? I can't believe a world-renowned scientist like Skinner would hold such a view. I think it would be best if I read his work myself, instead of relying on someone else's opinion of what he said.
In many ways, we were also that avatar, and in the following lesson, we share with you a different perspective of what should have been shared on our training in psychology. Let's first take a peek at what is actually inside, at least from a biological perspective. Let's now really go to town. What if the avatar could see herself like this?
Now that is just freaky,
might be her reaction. Removing the skin simply reveals particular changes that are happening inside. No psychological theories needed here. Something either happens or it doesn't. If anything, this image emphasizes the possibility of mapping the correspondence between several perspectives. From your perspective, you could envisage mapping data collected on both sides of the mirror. From the avatar's perspective, she could include that additional perspective that only she is privy to, her private world. All of these perspectives are covered in Skinner's writings, but students of psychology seldom learn this. Where Skinner takes things further is his emphasis on the behavior of the scientist, who grapples with all three perspectives at the same time. This is particularly evident in his analysis of the origins of everyday psychological terms we use when we make reference to our private world. He asks a basic question: how did our parents teach us to use these words when they cannot see our private world? Are there any implications to be derived from focusing on this question? Well, here is one that is sure to fry your brain a little. When the avatar says,
I have a brain,
there is nothing remarkable to comment on, or so it seems. However, it's a different story if you hear a brain saying,
I have a brain.
But there is only one brain, not a brain within a brain. In fact, it gets even more absurd, because there would have to be a brain inside the brain that speaks, and so on ad infinitum. Crazy stuff. We can take things even further in the lesson here. The actual sentence contains two other little conundrums. What is the I that has? In other words, from the biological perspective, you would see changes occurring the moment the word I is uttered. But what is this I? The same is true for all the words, of course, insofar as physiological correlates are concerned. The word have is also interesting. What does it mean to have? Surely it should be, is. Should this be said? I is the brain. Such a sentence would not only rightly stir arguments about biological reductionism, but it would also ignore something else. If we take a slightly different perspective, we can see that it involves what is called dualism. That is, there is reference to two things: the I and the brain. In fact, there is only one entity: the whole person. Something to ponder when you leave this tutorial. These two things are merely sounds generated because of a learning history. Entirely different sounds could have been generated with a different learning history. Isn't that so? Time to take a deep breath. We are only scratching the surface of how Skinner delved into the operational analysis of psychological terms. We draw your attention to this issue because most of his writing revolved around the analysis of the behavior of scientists. People who used to be those kids looking into a mirror. His focus was on reminding scientists that the language they acquired during their upbringing might somehow impact on how they analyze the behavior of all organisms, including themselves. We now add a little more realism. Here is Dean, watching himself in the mirror. Perhaps the most important thing to mention here is that when we observe any organism, we are observing changes over time. More on this later. Because they cannot observe these kinds of changes directly, most psychologists resort to the use of metaphor when explaining an observation. Here is an animated metaphor for storing things in the brain. Skinner's seminal paper, Why I Am Not a Cognitive Psychologist, illustrates the many problems created by relying on metaphor when developing a science. Most of psychology is a collection of metaphors dressed up in one kind of theory or another, often involving dualism. This point brings us to an important juncture. While neuroscientists might collect data on the kinds of changes shown in the mirror, on the other side of the mirror, the actual behavior is studied by behavior analysts. They don't study metaphors, only the actual behavior revealed when the image in the mirror is again covered by skin. In their science, behavior analysts focus on identifying independent variables that are responsible for behavior. In other words, their procedures create the data that can be observed in the mirror by neuroscientists. Neuroscience and behavior analysis work in harmony together. Many fascinating examples are described by Susan Schneider in her book, The Science of Consequences. In this image, we see that what Dean is viewing is an organism with a history. This history is reflected in the consequences of having interacted with the environment over a period of time. In other words, he is observing how an organism that was changed by its previous interactions with the environment now continues its journey. This point is again illustrated here. These next few slides provide examples of how a history of learning leaves Dean able to make sense of the images on the canvas. But what does it mean to make sense of? The images may encourage him to use metaphors, for example. Whatever his reactions, they are to be construed as dependent variables that are influenced by independent variables. Which, of course, are the images. Don't forget, this analysis applies to your reactions as well. In this final segment of the presentation, we bring a number of issues together, in this partially exposed version of Dean's neurophysiology. Skinner once said that a person is the focal point of a number of influences. The physicist Alan Watts said it another way. The skin does not separate you from the world, it connects you to it. Both of these statements make reference to a dynamic interface between a biological system and an environmental system. It is this interface that is the focal point for the endeavors of a natural science of behavior. In this animation, we see that the study of this interface necessarily involves a search for the natural laws governing how it streams over time. Once we understand these laws, we can use them in beneficial ways to influence the behavioral stream, as it flows through a variety of social contexts.